The town of Red Hollow, Kentucky had always been quiet. Tucked between rolling hills and thick forests, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the past was always whispered but never spoken aloud. And for Derek Lawson, coming back was never part of the plan. But his mother was dying, and there were things in Red Hollow that never let go. The house was just as he remembered it, peeling white paint, creaking porch, windows that stared out into the woods like watchful eyes. But the inside? That was different. The moment he stepped through the door, the air felt wrong. Not just old, not just dusty, but watching, like something had been waiting for him. His mother lay in the upstairs bedroom, skin pale, breath shallow. She barely opened her eyes when he walked in, but when she did, her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. "You shouldn't have come back." Her voice was hoarse, like something had been stolen from her. Derek frowned. "You're sick, Ma. You need help." Her grip tightened. "Leave, before it knows you're here." Derek's stomach turned. Before what knows? She swallowed hard. Then, in a whisper, the thing in the woods. That night he heard it. Not the crickets. Not the wind. Something else? A low, hollow breathing just outside his window. Slow, patient, waiting. Derek didn't move, didn't breathe, and then the scratching began. Long, slow claws dragging across the wood. His body locked up, because something was outside his window, and it was trying to get in. The next morning, his mother was gone. Not dead, not in bed, just gone. Her sheets were torn. The walls were covered in deep scratches. And on the floor, a trail of mud leading into the forest. Derek's pulse pounded. This wasn't sickness. This wasn't dementia. This was something else. And now, he had to go into the woods to find her. The trees swallowed him whole. The deeper he went, the colder it got. The sky, once bright, turned gray. The silence was thick, unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, a whisper. His mother's voice. Derek, his heart jumped. "Mom?" No answer. Just movement. Something shifting in the shadows. Something watching. And then, he saw her. She was standing between the trees, her back to him, unmoving, like she was waiting. Derek took a step forward. "Mom?" She turned. His stomach dropped, because that wasn't his mother. Not anymore. Her skin was gray, stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes were black pits, her mouth sewn shut, but still her voice came. Inside his head, "Run." Then the thing moved. Not like a person, like a puppet with its strings cut, jolting, twitching, bones snapping as it lunged at him. Derek ran. Through the trees, through the dark, through the whispers that weren't his mother's anymore. They were something else. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting for him all along. And now, it was coming home. The town of Red Hollow was quiet the next morning, but Derek Lawson was nowhere to be found. His mother's house stood empty, the front door wide open, and in the woods, a new whisper joined the others. Soft, echoing, calling a new name, waiting for someone else to come back home. The town of Red Hollow was still, not the kind of stillness that brought peace, but the kind that came when something had been taken. Something had been replaced. Derek Lawson had been missing for 6 months. No one spoke about him. Not at the diner. Not at the church. Not even in whispers. Because everyone knew People who went into those woods never came back the same. If they came back at all, then one night he returned. It was a storm that brought him home. Lightning flashing over the hills, the sky black and restless. And just before midnight, the old Lawson house lit up again. A single light in the upstairs window, like it had been waiting for him. But something was wrong. Because the man who stepped through the front door didn't look like Derek Lawson, the sheriff found him first. Got a call from the neighbors saying someone was inside the house. When he pulled up, the front door was wide open. Rain pattered against the old porch. The air smelled wrong, like damp wood and something rotting. "Derek?" the sheriff called. No answer. Then a sound from upstairs, a slow scraping noise, like fingernails against wood. The sheriff's throat went dry. Because he had been here before. Because he had seen this before. He stepped inside. The walls were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged, like something had been trying to claw its way out. The kitchen table was set for two, but the plates were covered in dust. And on the far wall, a single phrase carved into the wood. "It let me go." The sheriff swallowed hard. Then, from the staircase, footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming down, and when Derek stepped into the light, the sheriff felt his blood turn cold. It looked like Derek, same face, same build, but the skin was wrong. Too pale, like it hadn't seen the sun in years. And his eyes, they were too dark, too empty, like they belonged to someone else. Derek? The thing that wore his face smiled, but the sheriff knew that wasn't Derek anymore. Not really. The next day, the town whispered, Derek Lawson was back, walking the streets like he had never been gone, like he hadn't been missing for months. But something was off. He didn't speak much, didn't blink enough, didn't eat. And when people looked into his eyes, they felt something staring back, something that didn't belong. Then the disappearances began. It started with animals, dogs, cats, things left in the woods, their bodies ripped apart. Then a boy from town went missing, 9 years old, last seen walking near the Lawson house. His mother swore she saw Derek watching him, and when they searched the woods, they didn't find a body, just a trail of footprints leading to the old well near the Lawson property. And at the bottom, they found teeth. Human, too many, like something had been collecting them. The sheriff went back to the Lawson house, gun drawn, his hands shaking. Derek, I know you're in there. A sound from the darkness. A breath. Slow. Deliberate. Then a whisper. Not Derek. The sheriff's heart pounded. He aimed the gun higher. Then who the hell are you? A pause. And then a voice that was barely human. The one that let him go. The thing wearing Derek stepped forward. The sheriff fired. The bullet hit his chest, but he didn't fall, didn't flinch, didn't bleed. The sheriff froze, and the thing smiled. You should have left me in the woods. Then the lights went out. The door slammed shut, and the town of Red Hollow never saw their sheriff again. By the end of the week, Derek was gone too. The house? Empty. The only thing left behind, a message carved deep into the walls. Letters scratched by something that didn't have human hands. It's still hungry. And just like that, Red Hollow went quiet again. But in the woods, something was still waiting, and it would never be full. The woods never let go. Not really. Not when something was still hungry. Not when something was still waiting. It had been a year since Derek Lawson returned to Red Hollow. A year since he walked back into town different. A year since the sheriff vanished trying to stop him. Then, one night, Derek disappeared again. Just like before, the Lawson house, empty. The doors, wide open. The only thing left behind, a message carved into the wall. It took me back. But the thing about Red Hollow, it never forgot its ghosts. And this time it had chosen another. Her name was Sarah Miller. She had just moved to town. Didn't know the history. Didn't know the rules. All she knew was that she had found a house for cheap. Too cheap. She should have asked why. But she didn't. And now, she was living in the Lawson house. It started with the scratching. Long, slow. Something dragging claws against the walls at night. She thought it was mice. Then one night she woke up to find the closet door open. Inside, something was carved into the wood. Deep, uneven, like it had been done with bare hands. Let me out. Sarah didn't sleep that night. The next day, she went into town. Asked questions. People didn't answer. Didn't look at her. Like they were afraid. She finally got the truth from an old man at the diner. A man with hands that shook as he spoke. "This town don't belong to us," he said. Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man swallowed hard. "It belongs to the thing in the woods." Sarah laughed. Until she saw his face. There was no humor there. Only fear. That night, the air turned cold. Too cold. She woke to whispers. Soft. Crawling through the walls. She grabbed her phone. Checked the time. 3:03 a.m. Then, a sound from downstairs. The front door unlocking. Sarah's breath caught. She reached for the baseball bat beside her bed. Stepped slowly into the hall. Creak. Her pulse pounded. She turned the corner and froze. Because the front door was wide open. And just beyond the porch, standing at the edge of the trees, was Derek Lawson. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was gone. But now, he stood barefoot in the dirt. His clothes ripped, his skin pale as a corpse, and his mouth moving, whispering something too quiet to hear. Sarah's hands shook. "Derek?" No answer. She took a step forward, and he twitched, like something had yanked him backward. Then he spoke. "You need to run." Sarah's stomach twisted. Run from what? Derek's eyes darkened. His voice dropped to a whisper. It followed me back. Then he turned his head, slow, like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. And when his eyes snapped back to hers, they were filled with terror. "Close the door." Sarah hesitated. "Derek, what's..." Close the door. Then, from the woods, a sound. Low. Guttural. Like something that had been waiting too long. Sarah slammed the door shut. And outside, the trees shook. Something was coming. The next day, Derek was gone. No footprints. No sign he had ever been there. But Sarah knew this wasn't over, because now it knew where she lived, and it was only a matter of time. The first nightmare came 2 days later. Sarah saw herself standing in the woods, alone, staring at something she couldn't see. But she felt it breathing, felt it watching. And when she tried to wake up, she couldn't. Her body wouldn't move, wouldn't blink, wouldn't breathe. And then, a whisper. Soft. Rotten. You let it in. Sarah woke up gasping, and beside her, on the pillow, was a clump of dirt, like someone had been digging. She tried to leave town, packed a bag, drove to the highway, but the road never ended. No matter how far she went, the road just looped back to Red Hollow, over and over and over, like the town wouldn't let her go, like it had chosen her, just like it had chosen Derek. That night she heard footsteps inside the house, heavy, slow. She grabbed her bat, tried to stay quiet. Then, a shadow moved in the hallway. She gripped the bat tighter, heart pounding. And when the figure stepped into the light, she stopped breathing. It was her, standing at the other end of the hall. But the thing that wore her face, it wasn't human. Its mouth sewn shut. Its fingers too long, and in its hand, it held a knife. Then, in her own voice, it whispered, "Let me in." Sarah ran. Through the house, through the back door, into the woods. She knew she shouldn't have. Knew she should have stayed inside. But something inside her was screaming to run. The trees closed in. The air turned heavy. And then, she tripped, fell hard. And when she looked up, there it was, standing in front of her, tall, thin, its body wrong, its face stitched together with too many mouths. Sarah tried to move, but it grabbed her throat, lifted her like she weighed nothing. Its fingers dug deep, and in her head, it whispered, "You are mine now." Sarah's vision darkened. The woods swallowed her whole, and when the sun rose, the town of Red Hollow was quiet again, because Sarah Miller was gone, and somewhere, deep in the trees, it was still hungry. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the empty roads of Cedar Ridge bathed in eerie silence. The trees on either side of the cracked asphalt loomed unnaturally, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Miles from the nearest town, Daniel Carter drove alone, his car the only source of sound in the suffocating darkness. His GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the last gas station he passed had been abandoned, its neon sign flickering weakly before dying altogether. His fuel gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty, but there were no road signs, no exits, just an endless stretch of road that refused to end. His hands tightened around the wheel. Something about the air felt heavier, the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Then, up ahead, he saw a sign of relief at first, until he read the words carved into the old wood. "Welcome to Briar Hollow. Population 0. Daniel's stomach twisted. 0? That had to be a mistake, a prank, someone vandalizing an old town sign. Still, something about the way the letters had been carved deep, jagged, made his pulse quicken. But there was no turning back now. His car sputtered, the gas needles scraping empty. He had no choice but to keep going. The road led him straight into the heart of Briar Hollow. Old Victorian buildings lined the street, their windows dark and lifeless. The lamplights flickered dimly, their bulbs coated in a thick layer of dust. No cars, no people. The entire town looked like it had been abandoned overnight. Yet everything was eerily intact. The grocery store shelves were still stocked with food. The barbershop store was slightly ajar, as if someone had just stepped out. Then he saw it. A light in one of the houses. A single candle flickering behind the second-story window of a decrepit mansion at the end of the street. He should have turned around. He should have ignored it. But something pulled him forward. The house was massive, its once grand exterior now rotting, the paint peeling in long curling strips. The front door was unlocked. The moment he stepped inside, the air grew cold. Not the kind of cold from a draft, but a deep, unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. The candle flickered on a wooden table in the grand foyer. Next to it, a letter. "You made it. We've been waiting." Daniel's breath hitched. He hadn't written this letter. He hadn't told anyone he was coming here. His fingers trembled as he lifted the paper, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then footsteps. Upstairs. Slow. Measured, like someone was waiting for him to come find them. He swallowed hard, his body screaming at him to leave, but his feet moved on their own, step by step up the grand staircase. The walls were lined with portraits, faces staring at him, all of them identical. The same woman. Long black hair, hollow eyes, her lips parted in a near smile. Each painting showed her in a different pose, but something about the way her gaze followed him sent a shiver down his spine. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. Then, from the farthest room, a whisper. "Come in." Daniel's breath came fast. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. The whisper had come from inside. He pushed it open. The room was empty. Nothing but dust-covered furniture and a single chair in the center of the room. The candlelight from downstairs barely reached inside, but he could see enough to know he was alone. Or so he thought. The whisper came again, but this time it was behind him. Daniel spun. Nothing. Then something moved in the shadows. A figure standing just outside the window. A woman, long black hair, staring, smiling. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was the woman from the paintings. His hand shot to the doorknob, but before he could move, the candle downstairs went out. Darkness swallowed the house, and in the silence, the whisper came right against his ear. "Run." Daniel didn't think he ran. The hallway stretched longer than before, the doors shifting, the house groaning as if alive. He lunged down the stairs, nearly tripping over himself, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The front door was gone. Only another hallway, stretching endlessly. The whisper laughed. Daniel slammed into a wall, his hands searching blindly for a way out. Then he saw it. A mirror. At the end of the hall, a reflection, not of himself, of her. Standing behind him, he turned, but she wasn't there. Only in the mirror. Her mouth open too wide, her grin stretching into something inhuman, her fingers curled against the glass. And then, she stepped out. Daniel screamed. Everything went black. The next morning, a new traveler entered Briar Hollow. A woman, lost, her car low on gas. She saw the sign at the edge of town. "Welcome to Briar Hollow. Population 1. Daniel Grayson woke up gasping for air. The last thing he remembered was Briar Hollow. The mirror, the woman stepping out, the darkness swallowing him whole. But now, he was somewhere else. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew. The ceiling above him was wooden, old, with deep cracks running through the beams. He was lying on a bed, but the mattress was stiff, the sheets thin and yellowed with age. The dim glow of a lantern flickered from the bedside table. He turned his head. A window. Outside, a thick fog rolled over the trees. The forest stretched into the distance, but something about it wasn't right. The trees twisted in unnatural ways, their branches stretching toward the house like clawing fingers. Daniel's heart pounded. He tried to sit up, but his wrist was chained to the bed. His breath came in ragged gasps. The chain was old, rusted, but strong. He yanked at it, panic rising in his throat, That's when he saw it. The mirror. It stood against the far wall, its frame covered in black ivy. And in its reflection, the woman standing in the corner of the room, watching, smiling. Daniel whipped his head around. The corner was empty, but in the mirror she was still there. His pulse pounded in his ears. He tried to move, to get away, but the chain held him tight. Then the whisper, "You shouldn't be awake." His blood ran cold. The lantern flickered. The whisper came again. "Go back to sleep, Daniel." Daniel's throat clenched. The voice was inside the room now. Then, the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. Tall, thin, not human. Its bones cracked as it moved. Its fingers were too long, the skin stretched too tight over its frame. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The figure moved toward the mirror, and in the reflection, the woman's smile widened. Daniel yanked at the chain, desperate to escape. The creature raised its hand, and the mirror shattered. The lantern died. The room plunged into darkness. Daniel screamed. When he woke again, the chain was gone, but something was different. He was outside now. The woods stretched endlessly in all directions, thick fog coiling around the trees. His clothes were damp, his skin cold. The silence was unnatural, no birds, no wind, just an empty, heavy stillness. And then the bell rang. A deep, hollow chime shaking the ground beneath him. Daniel turned toward the sound. A church, towering in the distance, its wooden frame rotting, its windows shattered. A single light flickered inside. A shadow moved behind the glass. Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew he wasn't alone. He started walking. The trees shifted as he moved, their trunks bending away from him, as if guiding him toward the church. The air grew thicker, colder. The door was open. Daniel hesitated at the entrance. The scent of burnt wood and damp earth filled his lungs. Inside, the pews were broken, the walls covered in deep scratch marks. And then he saw it. At the altar, a book sat open, its pages covered in names crossed out. He took a step closer, and at the very bottom of the list, his own name. The ink was still wet. Daniel's pulse hammered. Then the whisper, "You were never meant to leave." The candles flickered, and the door slammed shut. Daniel spun, his breath coming in gasps. In the darkness, figures moved. Shadows. Dozens of them. Their faces were blank, their mouths stitched shut, their eyes were hollow pits. They began to move toward him. Daniel's chest tightened. His feet wouldn't move. The bell rang again. The whisper grew louder. "You belong to Briar Hollow now." The figures lunged. Everything went black. The next morning, a new traveler entered Briar Hollow. A woman, lost, her car low on gas. She saw the sign at the edge of town. "Welcome to Briar Hollow. Population 1." The old Route 191 stretched through the barren wasteland of northern Arizona, a road that felt like it had been abandoned by time itself. The gas station at the edge of Sable Hollow was the last sign of civilization for over 100 miles, and by the time Ethan Gray pulled in, his fuel gauge had dipped dangerously close to empty. The neon sign flickered erratically, buzzing like an insect caught in a web, and the single overhead light barely illuminated the rusted pumps. The air was unnaturally still, no wind, no sounds of insects, just an unsettling silence that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. Ethan stepped out of his car, glancing around. There was no attendant, no other cars, nothing but the endless desert stretching out into the darkness. The station itself looked like it hadn't been operational in years. But as he lifted the pump handle, the numbers on the screen flickered to life. He shoved his credit card into the slot, watching as the machine whirred and beeped like it was struggling to wake up from a long sleep. Then he heard it, a whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, carried on the dead air like a breath against his ear. He froze, glancing around. No one was there. A chill crept up his spine as he scanned the desert, but there was nothingly the vast open void of the highway stretching into the unknown. Then, just as he turned back to the pump, he saw his reflection in the car window. Except, it wasn't moving. His heart slammed against his ribs as he turned, eyes wide, staring into his own mirrored gaze. The reflection stood perfectly still, even as he took a step back, just a little too hollow. And then it smiled. A slow, deliberate grin that spread across its face, revealing too many teeth. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, but before he could react, the station lights cut out, plunging everything into suffocating darkness. The whispering returned, louder, closer. He fumbled for his phone, the screen casting a weak glow in the pitch-black void. The whisper swirled around him, indecipherable voices overlapping, crawling into his ears like insects. His hands trembled as he switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness and landing on something standing in the distance. A figure just at the edge of the light, its features obscured, its body twisted and elongated like something human that had been stretched beyond recognition. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching. Ethan's pulse pounded as he turned and bolted for his car. He yanked open the door, throwing himself inside, jamming the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and the headlights flooded the station in light. But the figure was gone. Only the whispering remained, curling around him like unseen fingers. He slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement as he peeled out of the station and back onto the highway. The darkness of the desert swallowed him whole, and still, the whispering didn't stop. It was inside the car now, inside his head. And as he glanced at the rearview mirror, heart hammering, his reflection was still smiling. The road stretched endlessly, a looping nightmare that refused to end. Ethan drove for hours, yet the landmarks never changed. The same sagging power lines, the same abandoned motels, the same cracked asphalt beneath his tires. It was as if the desert had folded in on itself, trapping him in a reality that didn't obey the laws of time. His phone had no signal. His fuel gauge was still full, despite the hours he had spent driving. And worst of all, he wasn't alone anymore. At first, he caught glimpses in the mirrors. A shape in the back seat, gone when he turned. A shifting shadow flickering along the road's edge. A handprint on the inside of the windshield when he knew damn well he hadn't touched it. Then, the voices began. Not whispers anymore. They were laughing. Soft, mocking inside his head, inside his bones, rattling against the inside of his skull like an insect trapped in glass. And then, the gas station appeared again. Ethan's stomach dropped. It was impossible. He had driven for hours. But there it was. The same rusted pumps, the same flickering sign, the same reflection that was still smiling at him. His breathing hitched. No. He slammed his foot on the gas, tearing past the station at breakneck speed. The car shook, the tires skidding against the cracked pavement. The radio flickered to life, blasting garbled static. Voices clawing their way through the speakers. "You let us in," Ethan screamed. The headlights flickered. The road disappeared. And suddenly he wasn't driving anymore. He was sitting back at the gas station, parked by the pump, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The whispering was everywhere now. He turned his head slowly. In the passenger seat, a figure sat motionless. It was him. Same face, same clothes, same wide, unnatural smile stretching across his lips. "You let us in." Ethan tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. His reflection tilted its head, watching him like a predator watching prey. Then it reached out and touched his face. The world ripped apart at the seams. The last thing he heard before everything went black was his own voice, whispering back, "You were never supposed to leave." The next morning, a state trooper found Ethan's car at the gas station. The engine was still running. The driver's seat was empty. The only sign of life was a single wet handprint on the inside of the windshield. And when the officer checked the security footage, his stomach turned to ice. Because Ethan had never gotten out of the car, had never even been there. Just an empty vehicle idling in the middle of nowhere. And as the trooper turned back to the car, the radio crackled. A voice, soft and familiar, whispering through the static. "You let us in." The desert was silent. Not the kind of peaceful silence found in nature, but something deeper, something wrong. A silence that listened, a silence that waited. The headlights of Ethan's car cut through the darkness as he sped down the seemingly endless highway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The whispering had stopped, but that didn't mean he was safe. He had made a mistake back at the gas station. He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, or worse, something had seen him. The radio was off, but faint voices still crawled through the speakers, layered over static, barely above a breath. He tried to ignore them, tried to convince himself they weren't real. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw it again, his reflection, sitting in the back seat, staring at him, smiling. Ethan slammed his foot on the brake. The tires screeched, the car fishtailed, and he came to a dead stop in the middle of the empty road. His breath came fast, his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned slowly, expecting to see something in the back seat. Nothing. But the whispering had started again. He reached for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. No signal. Of course. His fingers trembled as he gripped the gear shift, forcing himself to breathe. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop now. As he accelerated, the darkness outside the car seemed thicker, heavier. The highway stretched ahead of him like an endless ribbon, but something was wrong. He had been driving for hours, yet the scenery never changed. The same dead trees, the same cracked asphalt, the same sign on the side of the road, Sable Hollow. 6 miles. Impossible. He had left Sable Hollow miles ago. Or had he? He pressed the gas pedal harder, heart pounding. The speedometer climbed 50 miles per hour, 60, 70. He just had to get out of here. He had to. The gas station appeared on the horizon. Ethan's stomach dropped. It was the same gas station, the same rusted pumps, the same flickering neon sign. But this time, the lights inside were on, and standing beneath the buzzing glow was a man. No, not a man. Ethan knew it before he even saw its face. It was waiting for him. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers ached, but his body refused to move. The figure in front of the gas station took a step forward, then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. He turned the wheel hard, forcing the car onto the dirt shoulder, tires kicking up dust as he swerved around the station. He wasn't stopping, he wasn't looking, he just had to keep moving. But the moment he passed the station, his headlights flickered, and in the instant they blinked out, he wasn't in his car anymore. The smell of gasoline and rust burned his nose as his vision adjusted to the dim light. He was inside the gas station now, standing in front of the counter. The old register sat on the counter, covered in dust. Shelves lined the walls, empty and forgotten. The clock above the door was frozen at 3:13 a.m. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't listen. Then he saw it. His reflection, standing on the other side of the counter. But this time, it wasn't smiling. It tilted its head, studying him with something like curiosity. Then it spoke. "You were never supposed to leave." The voice wasn't his. It was deeper, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection lifted its hand and pressed it against the glass of the counter. The surface rippled like water. Ethan felt a pull, a force dragging him forward. His legs moved on their own, his body unwilling, as his reflection reached out. And then, darkness. He woke up to the sound of an engine humming. The scent of dust and desert filled his lungs. He was in the driver's seat. His car was running. The road stretched before him. His hands rested on the wheel. For a moment, he thought it had been a dream. Then he looked in the mirror and saw himself still standing inside the gas station, still watching, still smiling. The reflection raised a hand, waved, and whispered, "You let us in." The world around him flickered, and Ethan began to forget who he was. The town of Ravenswood was a place that should not exist. It sat on the edge of a dense, ancient forest where the trees grew too tall, their branches twisted together as if whispering secrets to one another. No one moved there. No one left. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. The town had no mayor, no police, no schools. It was as if it had been forgotten by time. But still, people lived there, their lives playing out in eerie synchronization, their faces always turned slightly away when you looked at them directly. David had never heard of Ravenswood before. It wasn't on any maps, no GPS could find it, and no records of its existence could be traced. But when he received an anonymous letter offering him a job as a historian for a town that shouldn't exist, something in him was drawn to it. The letter had no return address, only a short instruction. Arrive before sundown. Do not speak of this place to outsiders. David had spent his career studying strange places, ghost towns, and abandoned settlements. But something about this was different. As he drove toward Ravenswood, the road stretched longer than it should have, the trees lining the path growing denser, pressing in as if trying to consume the road itself. The sunlight dimmed far too early, the sky a strange shade of gray even though his clock told him it was still midday. Then, just as his fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, he saw the sign for Ravenswood, rusted and barely hanging onto its post. As soon as his car crossed into the town, his radio crackled to life, a single voice whispering, "You shouldn't have come." Then, silence. David's stomach twisted. The town looked normal at first glance rows of neatly maintained houses, their windows dark and empty, a small general store, an old church, a library. But the deeper he drove, the wrongness settled in. The houses were too perfect, as if they were copies of one another. Each door was painted the same dull shade of blue. Each mailbox tilted at the same unnatural angle. And the people, they were there but they didn't move right. Some stood completely still on their porches, their faces blank, their eyes following him without turning their heads. Others walked, but their movements were too synchronized, their footsteps too quiet. David pulled into what looked like a town office, his hands sweaty against the steering wheel. The letter had said to report here. He stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust, despite the furniture being perfectly clean. A single receptionist sat at the desk, not moving, not blinking. "David Turner," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm here for the historian position." The woman's eyes flicked to him, slow, mechanical. "You are early," she said in a flat, empty tone. "That is good. We begin at dusk." David swallowed hard. "Begin what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed him a single-keeled brass, heavier than it should have been. "Your lodging," she said. "Do not go outside after dark." Something about the way she said it made his skin crawl. David took the key and left. His assigned house was at the end of the street, where the road met the beginning of the forest. The trees loomed behind it, their branches too still, their shadows stretching too far. The inside of the house was fully furnished, like it had been lived in for years. But when he checked the fridge, the cabinets, there was no food. No dishes. No signs of life. And yet, dust did not settle anywhere. As the sun began to sink, David stood by the window, watching the town. That's when he saw them. The people of Ravenswood, all of them leaving their houses at the same time. In perfect, unbroken silence, they walked toward the church in a long, orderly line. No one spoke. No one broke formation. David's pulse quickened. Something was very, very wrong. The receptionist's warning echoed in his head. Do not go outside after dark. His hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to follow. Then, he noticed something worse. From the edge of the forest, figures began to emerge. Not people. Something else. Their bodies were elongated, bent at unnatural angles, their faces smooth and featureless, their limbs twitched, their fingers stretching too far. And the people of Ravenswood, they didn't react. They continued their march toward the church, as if they couldn't see what was coming toward them. David took a step back from the window. The air grew colder. Then, his television turned on by itself. The screen was black and white, showing grainy footage of the very same scene happening outside. And then, the camera panned slowly until it was showing inside his house, until it was showing him. His breath caught in his throat. A voice, garbled and distorted, whispered through the speakers. "You shouldn't have come, David." The power cut out. The whispers began. Not from the television. From inside the house, he wasn't alone. David didn't sleep that night. The whispers never stopped. They came from the walls, the floorboards, the vents. Soft, distant voices that grew closer every time he closed his eyes. And the worst part? They were calling his name. By the time dawn arrived, he knew what he had to do. He had to leave. He grabbed his car keys and bolted out the door. But the town had changed. The street signs were gone. The roads no longer led where they should. The town was trapping him. A single road stretched ahead, leading straight into the forest. And at the end of it, something was waiting. Something that looked like him. David's stomach twisted. The thing in the road smiled. And behind him, the town whispered, "You belong to us now." The trees rustled. Not from the wind, from laughter. David ran. But the forest was waiting. And Ravenswood never let anyone leave. David didn't remember how long he had been running. The trees never ended. No matter how far he went, no matter how many turns he took, the forest stretched on forever, swallowing the sky, the air, his sanity. The sun never rose. The moon never set. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, only silence. And somewhere in the distance, the whispers followed him. He had left Ravenswood, or at least he thought he had. But the town had done something to him. It had changed him, and now the forest wouldn't let him go. He stopped when he saw the house. It sat in the middle of a clearing, old and crumbling, its wooden frame warped with age. A place that should have collapsed decades ago, yet still stood. David's breath was ragged as he staggered toward it. It was the first real thing he had seen in hours, or days, or weeks. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as it rocked with no wind. The windows were black, swallowing any light that touched them. The entire house smelled of rot. But he had no choice. David stepped inside. The floor sank under his weight. Dust rose in the air, swirling in strange patterns, as if disturbed by something unseen. The house was furnished but wrong. The chairs were too tall. The pictures on the wall shifted when he blinked. A mirror stood at the end of the hall, and when he looked into it, his reflection wasn't his. It was watching him. Smiling, David's stomach twisted. The whispers grew louder. Then, something moved upstairs. A slow, deliberate footstep, followed by another, then another. David's heart hammered in his chest. The mirror reflection tilted its head and whispered, "You should not be here." David ran. The stairs felt endless. The house was bigger inside than it should have been. The hallways stretched unnaturally, twisting into places that shouldn't exist. And then he found the room. The door was open. Inside, a single wooden chair sat in the center. And tied to it, David. He stopped breathing. He was staring at himself. The other David lifted his head, his face gaunt, his eyes black voids. His lips cracked as they twisted into a grin, his voice raspy. "Took you long enough." The door slammed shut behind him, and the lights went out. David woke up somewhere else. A small office. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A desk sat in front of him, old papers stacked neatly. The smell of dust filled the air. It looked normal, too normal. And then he saw the nameplate on the desk. It read, "David Turner, Ravenswood historian." His breath caught in his throat. The door opened. A woman stepped in. The receptionist? The one who had given him the key to the house in Ravenswood. But her face, it was wrong now. Her skin was smooth, her eyes too large, too dark. Her smile stretched too wide. "You're ready now," she said. David shook his head. "Number I left. I ran. She placed something on the desk. A letter. His own handwriting. It read, "Welcome to Ravenswood, David. You're finally home." His vision blurred. His hands trembled as he touched his own face. The skin felt different. His heartbeat slowed, and in the window's reflection, he saw his own body still sitting in the chair, eyes hollow, mouth smiling. The real David was already gone, and Ravenswood had won.